Now, the country has recorded the highest ever number of COVID-19 cases as we approach phase 2 of the Omicron response, and anti-mandate protesters are refusing to leave Parliament's grounds entering week 2 of their occupation. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern joins us now for more on this. Good morning, Prime Minister.
Morena.
Do you approve of the measures that the Speaker is taking to move these protesters on?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I don't approve of the tactics we're seeing from the protesters because, let's be clear, Parliament is a place of protest. We are all used to seeing protests here, and some of our most important movements have actually started through people movements that have involved protest. You know, Nuclear Free New Zealand, the right for women to vote. But what we've seen out there, I have to say, seems much more anti-vaccination more than anything else. It's included yelling abuse at people who are walking around with masks on, occupying spaces where businesses are operating, blocking people's ability to move around freely. That is moving beyond a protest. In fact, to me, it looks like an imported style of protest that I have not seen in New Zealand before, complete with Trump flags and Canadian flags.
When it
comes to the management of the protest, so Melissa, and the Speaker, or indeed the decisions by the police, you know, ultimately I need to let them do their jobs. Those are their jurisdictions. But I would just note that it has been a protest with constant noise, constant music and speaking and quite threatening behaviour. And so that's the context of the environment that we're all in down here at the moment.
And there is an element of anti-vaccination, but there is also a group there who are representing people who have lost their jobs, who are just angry at the vaccine mandates. And they actually represent people who are not there on Parliament grounds, but who feel like that within our society because they may have lost their jobs. Do you feel the appropriate way to deal with those people is to spray water on them?
Firstly, I'm not going to get into the way of managing a protest in its totality because those ultimately very clear distinctions. I'm going to be careful to make sure that I'm not making judgments around the way we deal with protest at Parliament because it's a dangerous place to be in, politicians dictating particularly the way that the police might choose to deal with them. But
although the police have said that they actually don't agree with those tactics,
Melissa, if this were a protest that was solely around the policies that are being used to manage a pandemic, then why is it that every journalist who stands out on that forecourt is being hurled abuse about telling the truth? There are signs calling for the execution of politicians. There is more than just an anti-vax rhetoric amongst some. It is strong. And so I wouldn't want to, for a moment, legitimise some of what I've seen down there because some of it is pure misinformation around the role of vaccines. And indeed, some people seem to believe that we're mandating the vaccine of children when clearly that is not true. So if I may, I'm going to speak to the rest of New Zealand around the issue of restrictions and the way they're being used. We will only use them so long as we need them. We've already moved away from lockdowns, which were an extraordinary thing to have to do to keep people safe, and we've moved away from that. We're already opening up New Zealand's borders again, and when we're in the position to do so, we will move away from vaccine passes and mandates in healthcare and education because those are the key areas that are being used.
Matt King has been on this morning and he has he's been among the protesters this morning and he has said over the past few days...
Sorry, repeat that?
Sorry, Matt King has been among the protesters in the last few days and they have basically said, or a majority of them said, if the mandates are removed and there is a date put on that they will leave. Can you put a date on vaccine mandates being removed?
So, again, I'm going to push back on the sense here that this is a group that we're seeing wanting to engage in political dialogue.
Regardless of who the protesters are, can you put a date on vaccine mandates being removed?
We've seen some horrific behaviour down there, and I'm not going to legitimise it.
I'm not talking about the protesters anymore. I'm talking
sorry,
about
if I could just finish, I am trying to answer your question. So my response here is not directed towards them because that is not what I've seen them asking for, but to New Zealand. And yes, legitimate questions we've had in the past around when do we ease up on some of the things we're having to use, we will lift them. But can I give you a date? Well, as our cases are increasing, it's very difficult for us to put that date on it. But we do anticipate being able to move away from that in the future. And when we can, we will. But when we're on the upside of a curve in an Omicron outbreak, now's not the time to do that. So we've also struggled in the past to put dates on the easing of different restrictions, but you've seen as soon as we can, we have moved away.
Can you put a date on moving to phase 2?
Today we'll be discussing as a Cabinet and with our public health officials the movement to phase 2, but you'll remember that the timeframes we put around that were based on case numbers. We said roughly when we hit in the order of 1,000, so now is the time to be having that discussion.
So Dr Aisha Verrill said on the 26th of January that numbers would be likely to be less than 1,000 a day for moving between phase 1 and phase 2.
Yep, so the printed version of what you've seen out, it's around, of course, it's very much dependent on how the system is operating, but around 1,000 before we move into phase 2.
So businesses will be quite interested in this because,
3.
of course, it will bring in the test to return. So can they plan for that happening within days? Would it be sometime this week?
Yes, and there's actually some workforces in particular circumstances who have been using that. Keeping in mind that scheme is everyone can continue to operate. We are not in the system or regime of lockdowns. Every business is continuing, obviously, to operate through, with the exception of those that use large gatherings. But this is an exemption for close contacts to go to work. Yes,
the close contact exemption scheme will come in with phase 2, and there's guidance here about how employees, if they are critical workers, can actually go and get rapid antigen tests. The thing, Prime Minister, is that you have to get those tests, if you don't work in, say, police, healthcare, DHB, you actually have to get a text from the Ministry of Health first. Then you have to take about 5 different kinds of forms of ID to a collection place and have a rapid antigen test order number. It seems a bit of a palaver. People have to jump through hoops to go and get it.
Actually, that's not actually correct, Melissa. It's pretty straightforward. So this is all about how is it that we identify that you're someone that is a close contact and therefore and also works in a critical workforce? Because what we don't want to do is have a bunch of close contacts unnecessarily in the workplace, because keeping in mind the likelihood, if you have someone in your household with COVID, the likelihood you'll have it is pretty high. So we do want to make sure it's only being used, that exemption. So I'll run you through the process, if I may. So a business can self-identify, jump online, say they consider themselves to be critical. They'll then get issued documentation that shows they're a critical workforce. Their worker takes that documentation, some personal ID, but they also have to show they're a contact, otherwise why would they need it? They go down to a local collection point, can be a pharmacy if it's a rural area, it can be any local amenity that we're working on to make sure they have them locally, and pick up a pack of 10, and that's it.
Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, thank you very much for joining us this morning.